Naya is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I can't imagine my life before Naya. I think you're hungry.
The biological imperative, as we all know, is to pass on genes. Most species on Earth use sexual reproduction. Why do this?
Hold on.
There has to be some fundamental biological evolutionary reason for sexual reproduction. This has been one of the major questions in biology for a very long time.
For 25 years, Robert Reinhoek has been returning to the remote hills of Sonora, Mexico, hoping to find clues to the enduring mystery: why sex? In this dry and forbidding landscape, he seeks those clues in the lives of fish.
To study the sexual process, which appears to be normal, predominant in most things, I study the diseases of sex, the pathologies of it. Little fish, in this case, that live in the Mexican deserts that have abandoned the sexual process. And the beauty of this is it's a natural experiment, because side by side in these same little puddles, we'll have sexual reproducers, we'll have asexual reproducers, all competing in these tiny little simple environments. I could try to study this in a massive environment like an African savanna, but I can't manage an African savanna. With my capabilities, I can manage a few small pools like this, and for 30 years I've been coming back to this part of Mexico to study what goes on in these pools. We got some. We did good. This is a good sample here. Look at how black these fish are. Wow. Look at the pigment on them.
Early on, Reinhoek discovered that 40% of the minnows in these pools were heavily infected with a parasite that causes black spot disease. The rest seemed relatively unaffected.
When we brought them back to the laboratory and started counting the spots, we noticed, well, my goodness, this is really neat. The asexual reproducers were taking much higher loads of parasites than the sexual reproducers on average. Why should they be more parasitized than the sexual reproducers? They were living right beside, because they're all being exposed to the same parasites in the water. There should be no fundamental reason for different parasite loads on these different kinds of animals, unless it had something fundamentally to do with being asexual as versus being sexual.
But what? The only thing to do was to keep walking and sampling and thinking. Finally, it hit him. He was looking at a real-world demonstration of the value of males, one suggested by an evolutionary theory called the Red Queen.
The Red Queen is an elegant idea. I think it's one of the great ideas since Darwin. And it goes back to a wonderful scientist, Lee Van Valen, who basically asked about, does evolution stop when things get perfectly well adapted to their environment? He said, of course not. Evolution is a race, and it's much like the race we saw in Alice and the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, where they were running just as fast as they can, and Alice says, isn't this curious? As fast as we run, nothing seems to change. We're staying in the same place. And the Red Queen says, yes, you have to run just as fast as you can to stay in the same place. You're living in a complex world, a world full of parasites, a world full of viruses and bacteria, predators, competitive species, all basically evolving too. And the moment any species stops evolving in response to these challenges and threats, it's doomed.
The cloned fish have stopped evolving. They're an easy target, especially for a short-lived, fast-evolving parasite. But the sexual fish are a moving target. Each is a new combination fashioned from its parent's genes.
So as far as the parasite is concerned, every individual in that sexual population is a unique and individual challenge, and that slows down the transmission of the parasite through the sexual part of the population.
Here was a solution to the mystery of sex. It's the best defense against rapidly evolving enemies. Or so it seemed, until a bad drought dried up the pools, killing the minnows and throwing everything into question. Eventually, the water returned, and so did the minnows, having slowly worked their way back up the hill from pool to pool. When Weinhoek checked the top pool, he made a disturbing discovery. Now the parasites were decimating the sexual fish. The clones were doing quite well, thank you.
This is absolutely contrary to anything we'd seen for many years previous to this. Now it was completely upside down. Something mysterious was going on. Now an opportunity, you see, to do some science. Nature had done an experiment for us. We had to find out what happened, what changed. We collected the fish. We can then examine them carefully, and what we found in this case is that the sexual species, in the process of recolonization, had lost its genetic variation. It had become inbred.
Testing revealed the sexual fish to be clone-like. They now resembled each other genetically. And since they outnumbered the true clones, they were being targeted by the parasites. As a final test, Weinhoek conducted a simple experiment.
I went downstream with my bucket into a lower pool where the fish still had genetic variability, and I took some fish from there, put them in my bucket, hiked back up the mountain, and threw them in the pool where the fish had lost variation, and came back a year later just to see what happened. And it's just a wonderful result. This parasite load in the sexuals had dropped right down to the levels it used to be in the past. The asexuals now were taking the brunt of the parasite attacks. And when we examined those sexual fish, we found that we had, in fact, successfully transplanted genetic variation into that pool. And you see, that's precisely the point. That's what sex does. Sex generates variability among offspring. And when you take that away from a sexual reproducer by inbreeding them, or cloning them, you've lost the very benefit of sex. It's that generation of an immense amount of diversity. And that diversity of your offspring, it provides challenges to everything around it, challenges to the parasites, challenges to the viruses, challenges to your competitors. That's the beauty of the sexual process, is the variation and wonderful diversity it creates.
Some believe it all got started billions of years ago, with two single-celled creatures sharing a chance encounter in the primordial night. They meet, and genes are exchanged. That's what sex is all about. The moment is brief, but it leaves them a little bit stronger, a little more likely to survive and reproduce. Males and females came later, when random change produced a creature that was small and fast, which turned out to be an evolutionary advantage. Organisms with reproductive cells like that are called males. Their goal is to find organisms with a different specialty, providing the nutrients life requires. They're called females. These early pioneers evolved in time into sperm and eggs. Males produce sperm by the millions. With so many potential offspring, it doesn't pay to be fussy about eggs. A better strategy is to try to fertilize every egg you can. Eggs are more complex than sperm and take a larger investment of energy. Females make only a limited number of them. Fewer eggs mean fewer chances to pass on genes. And that means females, unlike males, do better if they're choosy. At a deep biological level, males and females want different things, regardless of how things appear on the surface. Small sperm versus large eggs, quantity versus quality. These are the evolutionary roots of the war between the sexes. This war is a lot more than fodder for poets, philosophers, and soap opera writers. It can explain a lot about how species evolve and why they look and act the way they do. Charles Darwin was the first to recognize the evolutionary significance of sex. He came to it because his theory of natural selection had a major problem. It beautifully explained why all polar bears have heavy coats. Over time, any trait that improves an individual's chances of survival should spread through the entire population. But it offered no help in explaining the wild extravagances found throughout nature, like the peacock's tail.
Yeah, Darwin had a real problem with peacocks. In fact, he once said, the sight of a peacock makes me sick, because he really didn't understand how it could evolve.
An extreme reaction, perhaps, but it is hard to see a peacock's tail as something other than an impediment to his survival.
They're heavy, they're difficult to carry around, they take a lot of energy to grow, they're conspicuous, and basically they're going to slow an animal down if it's running away from a predator.
And it wasn't just the peacock's tail that Darwin's theory of natural selection couldn't explain. There were also the elaborately ornamented carapaces of beetles and the Baroque extravagance of butterflies, and even the delicate songs of birds. Theologians of his day argued that God created ornate flowers and feathers to inspire man's wonder and devotion. Darwin was convinced there had to be an evolutionary explanation, just as there had to be an evolutionary explanation for why so many of nature's ornaments are seen only on males.
If natural selection is operating on all organisms the same, why is it in nature that you can see differences between males and females? And these differences are actually quite large. Things like antlers or large body size in males that are clearly connected to maleness or femaleness, as if there were two paths. And this really doesn't make sense if you accept evolution by natural selection. That should be operating the same on everybody.
It took him several decades to think of it, but eventually he happened upon the idea of sexual selection, which is really Darwin's most ingenious idea, I think. These ornaments are not for our good, they're to advertise each individual's fitness, its goodness as a mate to the opposite sex of its own species. In a sexually reproducing species, survival is no good if you don't find a mate. If you don't convince somebody that you're good enough to copulate with, to have offspring with, your genes will die with you. You won't leave any descendants.
Darwin saw two strategies at work in the courtship idiosyncrasies of different species. For males, it's competition. For females, it's choice. Males fight for access to or control over the females themselves, or a resource females need, like food or territory. Sometimes this competition gets downright nasty. For the wattle jacanas of Panama, survival of chicks is so uncertain it's led to an amazing gender role reversal. Jacanas lose a lot of chicks to crocodiles. They might have died out long ago if they hadn't found a way to produce more offspring. Their solution? The female lays the eggs, but it's the male who keeps them warm and raises the chicks.
If a female is the one who is freed of parental care, she can produce more eggs more rapidly, and both she and the male benefit from that.
As jacana females cut back on nurturing, their reproductive strategy began to change. Now, it's the females who care more about quantity than quality. Now it's the females who fight over mates. Over time, they've taken on traditionally male characteristics.
It's the females that are larger. Females are highly aggressive. Females compete for access to males. And a highly, quote, successful female is one who is able to accumulate and defend, if you will, a harem of 4 or even 5 mates.
When a female conquers another's territory, she often breaks the eggs and kills the chicks of the vanquished mother.
This makes sense, despite its grisliness. The male instantly becomes available to take her eggs. And in fact, that's what happens. Within hours, the female is sexually soliciting to the male. He starts mounting, and within a few days to a week, he has a clutch of eggs that are her eggs.
So here is an evolutionary revelation about gender. Male and female roles are not set in stone. They're largely determined by which sex competes for mates and which invests in the young. Solving the problem of how to pass on your genes can even trigger the emergence of a new species.
There's a new group of scientists called evolutionary psychologists, and they're interested in how human evolutionary history affects the way we think today. Now, keep in mind that that means 4 million years of evolutionary history, a time during which we were almost always roaming the plains and forests of Africa. How does that affect the way we operate today? They've been looking at things like mate choice, different kinds of standards of beauty, social exchange. And they have a very long way to go before they can prove some of their ideas, but they're still some of the most interesting and provocative issues around today.
Evolutionary psychologists begin by pointing out that, regardless of the culture in which we grow up, we all tend to respond the same way to a surprising variety of things. Most of us find spiders unpleasant, certain body types sexy, and particular smells disgusting. All, they say, are legacies of our evolutionary past.
If we ask, for example, do rotten eggs smell bad? It's just a molecule, hydrogen sulfide gas. It doesn't have the smell. We have evolved a brain to generate a negative feeling for something that's detrimental to our gene survival. This indicates biological contamination, right? If you were a dung beetle, the smell of rotten eggs might smell wonderful to you because the smell doesn't reside in the molecule. It resides in the evolved brain.
To an evolutionary psychologist, it's no accident Hollywood turns to snakes when it wants to put a hero in danger.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Dangerous snakes don't slither into most of our lives. Still, more than a few of us share Indiana Jones's instinctual fear.
You go first.
Another deeply embedded instinct we may have inherited from our ancestors is the ability to smell a genetically compatible mate. In one unusual experiment, scientists had young men sleep in the same t-shirt for a couple of nights, until the shirts were infused with their unique smell. It turns out, when women were asked to rate the sex appeal of the different men based only on the smell of the shirts, they consistently rated higher the shirts of men whose immune genes were unlike their own. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Choosing a mate with different immune genes gives offspring a greater protection against viruses, parasites, and other pathogens. The ability to smell good genes is a remarkable talent. But like most instincts, we don't even know it's at work. We just like the way someone smells, or the way they look, or because they make us laugh.
People don't have sex because they want to perpetuate their genes. They don't like someone because they want to get better genes. They do things because they feel good to them. They have sex because it feels good. The relationship between those good feelings and gene survival may not even be known to them. They never think about that. They do things because it feels good, and they never think, why do those things feel good? Why have we evolved a brain that makes certain things feel bad to us or certain things feel good to us? And that's the question that we're addressing.
Like many men, Victor Johnston spends as much time as he can looking at beautiful women. But for Johnston, it's an academic pursuit, part of his effort to understand the evolutionary roots of beauty.
You have to remember that beauty is a bit like sugar. In a hunter-gatherer world, the source of sugar was ripe fruit. So if you like the taste of sugar, you got a very nutritional diet. And now we've separated the sugar from the nutrient, the sugar's actually killing us. It's bad for us. And yet we still have this preference for it. Well, beauty may be something the same. Beauty is just a configuration of facial cues that we find to be attractive. These are cues that are telling us something about that individual, something biologically important. People like very full lips, and these are due to estrogens at puberty. And they also like females with short lower jaws and narrow lower jaws, and this indicates a low testosterone level. And that combination of high estrogens and low testosterone is correlated with fertility. In a hunter-gatherer world, it was important to detect these cues. But in today's world, we can manipulate fertility. We have fertility drugs and contraception. It doesn't have the same importance, but we still react to it. It still affects our behavior.
The next face I want you to find, Sarah, is the face that would be the most attractive male face.
Woohoo! The most attractive male.
Yeah, the most attractive male face from this range of face.
To study facial preferences, Johnston constructed a computer program that scrolls seamlessly between a sexy, fertile female face and a macho, virile male face.
That guy looks like he's right out of prison.
He's not
He's
very
gonna
popular.
hold up the, yeah, he's not very popular.
I'd like for you to find the best possible mate for a short-term relationship.
Short-term, okay.
A secret weekend.
Tends to be more masculine and pretty far down there.
For a short-term
Probably
mate, they want someone who's got a lot of testosterone markers on their face compared with a choice for a long-term mate. So whenever people are looking for good genes or a short-term relationship, they seem to be looking for these more masculine characteristics, but not so when they're looking for a long-term mate. They're looking for maybe a softer, kinder person for a long-term relationship.
Maybe someone that's kind of a little bit protective, help me out, watch over us.
Johnston tested many of his subjects more than once. To his surprise, he sometimes got different answers on different days.
When was the first day of bleeding for your last period?
It turns out that when women are ovulating and the chances of getting pregnant are high, there's a consistent shift in what they find attractive toward a more masculine-looking male.
I want someone at least my age.
Just like with the songbirds, that's when the unconscious lure of those good genes is strongest.
There are all sorts of things that mess up brains, and paradoxically, for that reason, brains make really good indicators of how fit you are during courtship. In fact, they're probably better indicators of that even than a peacock's tail is, of how fit a peacock is.
Jeffrey Miller's idea about sexual selection moving us down the path of larger brains is really interesting because it's not the same old saw of tool use, language, culture. It's something entirely different. Now, I have some questions about what's the female role in this? How do women fit in to this process? But still, it's a very intriguing idea, and he might just be right.
Miller is just getting started when he argues that the size of our brains can be attributed to our ancestors' sexual choices. He's also convinced that artistic expression, no matter how sublime, has its roots in our desire to impress the opposite sex. And that includes music, art, the poetic and storytelling uses of language, even a good sense of humor. According to Miller, they all stem from our instincts for sexual display.
I think when a lot of people produce cultural displays, what they're doing in a sense is exercising these sexual instincts for impressing the opposite sex. They're not doing it consciously, but what they're doing is investing their products with an awful lot of information about themselves. A lot of people are very upset about this idea that cultural displays are there to attract sexual partners. They find this somehow demeaning, as if sex is dirty and culture is clean and the two must be kept separate. I think this is a basic mistake. I think the capacity for artistic creativity is there because our ancestors valued it when they were making their sexual choices.
Miller knows his ideas about art, culture, and the human brain are controversial. He's also convinced that as experimental techniques improve, it'll be possible to determine whether he's right or wrong. Sex is at the heart of evolution. The process of mixing and passing on genes produces variation that helps species meet the challenge of life in a competitive world. Sexually selected variations are those that help individuals find mates and successfully raise young. That's how, for humans, sex became fun and parenting rewarding. Those of our ancestors who took pleasure from sex and satisfaction from parenting had more surviving offspring than those who didn't. That was true generation after generation. These traits are now almost universal. Even if we choose not to have children, we still enjoy sex. And even when we adopt a child who doesn't carry our genes, we can still find parenting rewarding.